Clearly, it's a difficult one, but according to the constitution of that country, you can only have 2 terms. Now, unfortunately, when the matter was taken to court, it ruled that Nkurunziza can still stand for elections because the first term, it was a decision of parliament, not the people. But other judges held a different view then, and some of them have since left Burundi. That is why international community believe that this matter still has to be looked at to ensure that really if the Constitutional Court is right, is it based on what's in the document that was signed in 1993, the Arusha Agreement, and later in 1998, where our late former President Nelson Mandela and Mwalimu Nyerere were part of that agreement to ensure that there's peace in Burundi.
Sophie, now this has been openly condemned by a few countries, including the US, as well as AU chair herself, condemning the idea, flatly saying that the environment in Burundi currently is not conducive to start any talk of holding the polls. What would happen if the polls went ahead as they're forging on? Would these elections be credible thereafter?
They will not be credible. You look at the visuals coming from Burundi and pictures from those refugee camps in Rwanda, in DRC, in Uganda, in Tanzania. Many people have left the country. Therefore, you can't say elections will be credible. It is for that reason. Even our president, President Jacob Zuma, who was involved in the negotiations some years ago when he was the deputy president of the country, has called on Nkurunziza to step aside, not to avail himself, even though the Constitutional Court has ruled that he should do so. But I think it is a wise advice. It depends on Nkurunziza himself whether he will indeed listen to many voices.
To actually put the people of his country first before himself. Now, speaking of President Sophie, President Jacob Zuma has also weighed in on the matter. Tell us about his stance on this matter.
His stance is clear, as I indicated. The current president shouldn't avail himself for re-election. And he has reasons. He understands the Arusha Accord. He understands the peace agreement, which was later signed in the presence of late President Mandela and late President Nyerere. It is for that reason he feels very strong that he shouldn't avail himself, because at that time, that whole conflict affected the entire Great Lakes regions. And President Zuma is saying we cannot have the same situation where you have a civil war in the Great Lakes region. That region is very, very volatile.
Speaking of the Great Lakes, Minister in the Presidency, Jeff Radebe, will be holding a meeting with a few leaders from the Great Lakes. Tell us about this meeting, Sophie.
He, in fact, visited different countries in that region. He visited Burundi. He spoke to President Nkurunziza, delivering President Jacob Zuma's message that President Nkurunziza shouldn't avail himself. He then moved to Rwanda, where you have many Burundians fleeing to Rwanda, saying to President Kagame, this is President Jacob Zuma's position. He also spoke to President Museveni in Uganda, where he communicated the same message in terms of what is the view or the views of President Jacob Zuma.
Sophie, look, SA Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa will be joining the East African leaders on Wednesday. But why do you think him in particular? I mean, we saw what he did in Lesotho in the conflict there.
Well, as you pointed out, on Wednesday, the Great Lakes region leaders, that we normally call them the East Africa Community Development, the leaders from that particular region will converge in Dar es Salaam, where they are going to re-look at this crisis, but look back from 1993 when the agreement was signed, and then move to 1998, where South Africa played a role, where President Mandela was present, and later he handed over the task to President Jacob Zuma to assist. Therefore, President Zuma is still seized with this problem to ensure that we don't see a civil war again in that area. But he chose to send Ramaphosa, Deputy President of the Republic, because he was invited in his capacity as the head of state of South Africa, who was once involved in this situation. But unfortunately, you are aware the president was in Russia. He delegated Mr. Ramaphosa, Deputy President Ramaphosa, because Deputy President Ramaphosa is a man who has been involved in many negotiations. As you pointed out, he recently struck a diplomatic coup by ensuring that Lesotho move towards a stable environment. We saw the election, we saw the inauguration of the Prime Minister, and it looks like Lesotho is stable. But let's hear what Israel Mkhize, an analyst from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, had to say about the man Cyril Ramaphosa.
Let's have a look.
Because number one, in terms of bureaucratic view, is a sitting deputy president of South Africa. Number two, on his own capacity, he is no negotiator. He's got that on his CV, where the whole CODESA role that he played in transition and also in the transformation of South Africa around 94 to 96 in terms of constitution, leading the constitutional talks with Mr. Ralph Meyer. So he would have such credibility. We saw the role he played recently in Lesotho, so he would be a good person.
Well, Sophie, before I let you go, very interesting indeed. On the other hand, there's another very important meeting that I can't let you go without telling us about that is happening in Zimbabwe. What can you tell us about this particular one?
From tomorrow, the ministers from different parts of Africa, defense ministers, will be in Zimbabwe, where they are going to discuss a very important agreement, or maybe a protocol that was signed at the AU, where there's an agreement to have a standby force in the African continent. This standby force will intervene where there are conflicts in the continent. For an example, you have a situation now in Burundi. You may be called to send troops there. But at the moment, what you do, you normally ask member countries to contribute to the project or to the, conflict resolution mechanism. But there was a feeling from heads of states in the continent that we must have a force, a standby force, where you can all the time tap into their expertise and their skills to stop these conflicts in the continent.
And
because
not have to wait
as long as Africa find itself in a situation where it deals with conflict, prosperity will be a problem. Therefore, President Mugabe is head of AU currently, and recently at the SADC meeting you saw he handed over keys to Dr. Stegamina Task with the establishment of a center for conflict and resolution. And the standby force can use those facilities for training. Therefore, it's an important meeting, and Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, the AU Commissioner, is also expected to attend. So it's another important development in the continent.
Very interesting indeed, that we might as well feel safer in our own continent to know that there is a third force to call who is special at hand and waiting for any conflict there to try and resolve it. All right, that is our foreign editor, Ms. Sophie Mokoena, talking to us about the conflict in Burundi.